Hey everyone, it's great to see you. Maybe we can consider some sort of roundtable to end our class today. I think it was a week or two ago. We all said, "How are you?" and "I am fine." Uh, we said it in different languages. So someone would ask in one language, someone would respond in another language, ask in that language, respond in another language. It'd be fun to think of another sort of question and answer chain that we can end the class on. Anybody have any suggestions? The weather is different every place we go.
If we end the class with have a good day, you guys. For instance, in Hadkil, it would be Singai La Da U, and the U at the end makes it plural. Have a good day, you guys.
Oh, Sangaila. Well, could we say, so if I'm person A starting it, I'll say, "I'm gonna go now." And then the next person would say, "Have a good day." So this will be like, so I'll be in language A. I'll say, "De kwa good, I'm gonna go." And someone will say, "Sangaila," and then they'll say in Haida, so that's in Haida, they'll say, "Have a good day." And then in Haida, they'll say, "I'm gonna go." And then someone will respond to them in another language. Say, "Have a good day, I'm gonna go. Have a good day, I'm gonna go." But we won't do that now or else we'll all have to go. Just keep it in mind. So the two phrases. Phrase one, "I'm going to go now." Phrase two, I guess phrase one should be, "Have a good day." Phrase two should be, "I'm going to go now." It just gives us a little bit a chance to hear each other's languages and just have a little bit of fun. So that's how we'll close the class. As far as opening the class, I thought maybe we'd take a look at a few phrases. I'll show you folks the notes that I took from "This Work is Not for Pessimists, Revitalization of the Inari Sámi Language." Does anybody have any thoughts about this article? So we're in week 6. We've read, I don't know, about 10 articles so far. Any thoughts, reactions?
I thought it
Is
was.
this?
Oh, Gook.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I thought it was kind of cool that they quoted the Downhowers in this article and that it was very positive, focused. You know, it's uplifting to see an example of a language having reversed language shift and move in a positive direction. So I thought that was pretty neat.
Yeah, and that it's a small language, right? If you look at their numbers, it seems feasible, right? To say, "Oh, wow, we only have so many people, so many speakers," so absolutely possible. And I will put the article from the Downhowers that they're referencing. I'll create a folder within our class called additional reading. I'll put it in there. It's good. So maybe I'll share my screen here. The notes I was taking as I was reading through it, a few things that I would think about. So they talked about some of these core values. So they said there were kind of two main core values that really helped their language revitalization. So the core values would be the most fundamental components of a group's culture, without which the existence of the group becomes uncertain. So these are pretty interesting if you want to think about some of these things in terms of having some core values for your language movement or your language program. And the two that they pointed out were language centrism and ethnic neutrality, which I thought were both really interesting. So language centrism would be the decision that all activities should be done in the target language by speaking and writing it, and that language revitalization cannot be achieved with another language being the language of power and use. So this comes back to a language movement, probably, I think, two of the most difficult things oh, there go the lights, are one, getting people to talk, and two, uh, ensuring that the language is a language of use. So that's where the language centrism comes, is that if we're going to do it, we do it in Sámi. If we're going to do it, we do it in Sámi. If we're going to do it, we do it in Hawaiian, right? The other concept was ethnic neutrality, which was a belief that all speakers and learners are welcome, regardless of their ethnicity, which includes non-Indigenous learners, speakers, and teachers. I thought it was interesting that they listed this as one of their primary sort of core values. So any thoughts on those concepts? Yeah, Coaching.
Yeah, reading, they had said that they had general gaps in the generations of speakers and that they were facing a lot of the same problems that we do, except they did only have one language, but they were running into which area, northern or south, should be the primary resource. So they got past that issue, but it only took them 20 years to get this group of core speakers, only some of them in the age of working, to get it to the point where folks who aren't of that Indigenous group, felt a need to learn it too, whether that was for a job or just because there's enough people around them. I don't know, but there was such a use for it, and so I was just really amazed that they were able to get there so fast within 20 years, in comparison to that 200-year scale that a lot of us look at. So
Right.
that was really encouraging.
Yeah, to say like, if you really hit the ground with this thing, you can go really fast. And then to also pull from it, like, you don't have to sacrifice dialects or different forms of the same language. Every language is going to have its own way of looking at dialects and maybe regional differences. So for me, a dialect is there's some discernible difference. Like, so for English, there could be, you could certainly look at dialects between, English spoken in parts of Great Britain and English spoken in different parts here. And you can also look at sort of the way that English is spoken in particular regional areas. Like, I went to school in the Midwest, and they spoke English just a little different there. There was quite a bit of influence of Norwegian and Swedish patterns of language that come into areas of Minnesota, and then there was just a particular sort of tone of voice and stuff. But some of that might fall under the category of a regional difference. And so for me, if I say dialect, I say there's some particular predictable pattern that we should be making sure we're transmitting and keeping alive in this particular area. This place uses an A sound, this place uses an E sound, this one uses a W, this one uses an M, and to try and maintain those dialects is important. And hopefully a language doesn't have to sacrifice a dialect to survive. A regional difference is sort of like saying, oh, we say this thing for that, and we say that thing for that. And it's just sort of kind of more small and unpredictable variances, which might be a different name for the same animal or something like that.
I think that this idea of ethnic neutrality as a strategy in their efforts speaks to where things are at, and some of the things that Suzuk mentioned in the last class about being even dialect neutral in the work with Inupiaq language revitalization, because dialect differences has been something that's been a challenge for people to work with in the revitalization effort in decades past. But we've got a lot of learners now who would hope that we could have some type of dialect neutrality so that someone who is from Kobuk River can come to UAF and learn some foundations in the North Slope dialect and go home and be expected and accepted to kind of represent that learning background while they reintegrate Kobuk dialect into their speech. So There's this effort by a lot of language learners now in the Inupiaq revitalization effort about being dialect neutral, that I think is kind of a micro and macro of this ethnic neutrality that's working out. It's working out to bring some more positive energy and some younger learners that that have helped to create and maintain a safe space in the work.
Yeah, that's really important because I know one community who has a dialect, and at one point that community was saying, well, we don't want this other person to come and teach us because they speak a different dialect, but we would actually not have anything, right? And so that does happen sometimes. I was like, we'll just wait for someone to emerge with our dialect before we start the process. And but then if those conversations are occurring, then there's got to be a way to sort of meet in the middle and say it's okay because we understand what the differences are, and it's better to learn and then to switch over to a dialect than to not learn at all, because it's much harder to go from English to the language than from a dialect within the language to another dialect. And to have these conversations, say we're not saying anything's more important, we're just saying if you're here and you can learn this one, then you go over there, you can learn that one, because it's really, for most languages, a dialect thing is just, it's kind of fine-tuning some things, and they are important, but it's a much smaller step than just learning the language from English.
That kind of fits in with something they shared with us at the TPRS training this spring, and that's that the more you hear the language, for example, one word, if everyone in the class says it and you're hearing it, that helps you improve, even if some people are saying it wrong, because even you'll hear that and you'll distinguish the two. So their idea was that it's all helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could teach a language for 20 years and realize you've been saying this one word wrong for 20 years. You know, these things happen as I've taught, and then I'll have some wonderful elders that would be in the room, like Dastya from Yakutat Nelly Lord. And she just had a way of, when we would say the word and I would say it and everybody else would say it, but her voice would cut through when she was trying to correct something for me. And she'd just give me this look, and it was really, I really appreciated that, because it was a lot of fine tuning, because there's a lot of people who sort of, they end up learning from the books, and you know, I just learned from the books and then I just started taking off. But then once you start moving into this realm of a language use, then even the teacher has to go through a lot of adjustments in terms of their own patterns and their own understandings. And this comes back to, I would probably add, in addition to these things, is sort of like to create this atmosphere of use, like just continue to think about this so that you have a safe and positive place where the focus is really on talking and much less on correcting and continually fine-tuning. Because if someone just comes and they want to have a conversation, but then you continually sort of shut them down or say, oh, I'll switch to English so I can explain how you're saying this part of the word wrong, then it really becomes a self-defeating mechanism. But it's also a challenge because a lot of teachers and a lot of speakers are very concerned about the accuracy of the language. But I think those concerns of accuracy can actually really slow things down. That doesn't mean you can just do it any way you want. But again, similar to the conversation about easier to switch to dialect, it's easier to sort of correct these things if we can just get everybody talking. Because there's so few people to talk right now that I think that should probably be somewhere up there really high in your goals, is really creating users of the language. Because if everybody's afraid of making a mistake, then they won't talk. Hokyunsk.
Yeah, that kind of the last part you were talking about kind of reminds me of something where that we run into a bit when we're able to work with fluent elders or first language elders, where you'll ask them if this is how you say something, and the answer will be like kind of a nod, like, yeah, that could work. And you have to kind of get it out of them, like, but would you say it like that? And like, oh, no, never heard it like that, you know. But you have to kind of, Yeah, it's kind of a getting them to speak up and correct the way that they would say it sometimes is pulling a little bit extra. And then the other thing in the reading, when I got to the part about ethnic neutrality and stuff like that, I couldn't help but think like you can't even have not you can't, but how for a lot of the concepts that we talk about here with even having native languages as requirements at some point and things like that, how you really just couldn't even, I think neutrality is a requirement for a lot of what we're trying to do up here and a lot of the programs that we're trying to keep moving forward with, especially the shallow number of speakers and stuff that we have. So yeah, of course it's all encouraged, but yeah, how that's not even kind of an option, it seems like right now for us, for sure.
Yeah, and it's wild because there are some Native American languages that don't allow their language to be documented, and they also don't allow people to use it who are not ethnically of that language group. Like I know of languages that are like that, and those are really interesting decisions. Like that's a sovereign decision of that language community. And so I think for our languages, like a lot of people will ask me, like, is it okay for me to use this because I don't speak, I'm not ethnically Tlingit, and I would say, well, if you live on Tlingit land, I think you should. I think that should be an obligation. Just I wouldn't go live in France unless I spoke French, or Italy unless I plan to learn Italian. So I just think that that's a different type of expectation. But coming back, one of the things that you'll see in the article by the Dowenhauers, which again, I'll put that in our folder and I'll share it with the gang. They do talk about this sort of, I think they call it an ethnic fallacy sometimes. There's a couple of things when someone comes in who is ethnically related to the language. Sometimes there's a bit of an expectation that I'm here by showing up, I have done the job. I have answered the call, and might not approach it with the same sort of work ethic as someone where it's just brand new to them. And so then that could create identity issues and potentially additional traumas to see someone who is not ethnically from the language take off and become a speaker sometimes faster. And that can create complex issues. And then that is compounded by the fact that some people feel like, well, if I don't succeed at becoming a speaker, I have failed my language and my culture, and I already have some identity potential like questions and disjunctures. And so these things can all sort of add together. So, but I do believe ethnic neutrality is important, but I also believe that everybody who comes to the language should have some expectations of how to act culturally within that language. Suzu.
Can I share? I was asked green. So I'm not gonna, I can talk so many times about so many things, but one of the things this weekend I was working on, I made a group page for Inupi Rakta. I'm trying to get a space for us to just practice speaking and listening and hearing, and so I created a Facebook group, and it's got bunches of members. But before I went public with it, before I published it, I was thinking about the rules, and I kind of want to just share the rules that I created for that group. And so if I could share the screen, it would be easier. And there it is. So let me find. And this is about the topic that we were talking about earlier in terms of how we end up discouraging. Oh, let me get rid of some of these other things. Sorry. Do you see the group rules from the admin? I don't know.
Yes, that's all we see. So
Okay, good. Okay, cool. So communication before precision. We're working to be understood first. Even if what we says might not be right, please never say that it is wrong. We can model a more precise way of saying something, but please don't tell someone to say it another way instead. Wait for them to ask for it. And then second one, use what you know as much as you can. Let's hear Inupiat everywhere in all contexts, even if it's not exactly what we want to say. If it's the best we can think of in a situation, use it. Maybe somebody will provide an even better word or phrase to use it or to use for the situation, which makes it a learning opportunity. And then don't apologize. This is a hard one for me, but I'm trying really hard right now to not apologize for my imprecise Inupiat. Just think somebody who offers me another more better way of saying something. And then being gentle with yourself. Give yourself the same grace you would give one of your friends. Don't fixate on your shortcomings, celebrate your progress, whether it's your accent, level of understanding, I gotta fix that, speed of your learning, be okay with agum. Be okay with good enough, or at least you're trying agum, as we begin, and then give grace to others. And this is where I wanted to focus on. It's easy to give grace to those who are helping. Give as much grace to the people who correct us, scold us, or make us feel weird or uncomfortable in any way. They're likely reacting out of some form of hurt and haven't yet learned how to show their support. They will. It will come. And so that's what I ended up coming up with in terms of how are we going to get ourselves to start speaking instead of being so shut down. So anyway, I was just excited about, I thought of that when we were talking about those things, and I wanted to share that.
Oh yeah, that's so important. And I think as you folks develop into facilitators, and many of you already are, and teachers, I think getting to what someone is saying instead of sort of getting them to say it correctly is so much more important. It's such a wonderful thing, I think, for a learner to say, whoa, they understood what I was saying, even if you're doing it, not in a correct way. Like, the important thing is communication is so key, because you can just continue to build on someone's confidence that they actually can do that. And then you can serve as sometimes as a go-between, especially as you teach more and more and more, there's certain patterns and things that you'll discover. And then if you can just sort of listen to people talk, sometimes you can communicate, you can listen to them and then become a bit of a moderator between them and maybe someone who's been speaking from birth. So you can sort of rearrange it a little bit and sort of tell them what they were saying without saying what they're trying to say is, but just sort of like repeat it for them. And then, or just sort of carry the conversation just forward, which I think is even better, because then I think it's just really neat, and it shows that someone can do that. And then there's different ways to sort of to ease folks into that, with starting off by just listing things and then sort of going into conversations and doing group activities where it's even like team A and team B, and they've got to create a fake conversation. So team A says something like, how's the weather? And then team B will huddle up and write a response, and then another question. And they just sort of do stuff like that. That's really fun and interactive and keep people going. And then once you move into these immersion settings, then I think that would really help people. And I think it's good to have those guidelines. Like, we've even talked here about having an actual code of conduct that has some of the bigger sort of issues as well, which really has to do with, like, this is a safe place and don't violate the safety of others. And you're agreeing to this, and we also have a process, because we had some difficulties here with people who were elders who were publicly attacking people in the language. And so if you didn't speak the language, you might just be watching, be like, wow, they're using the language a lot. But if you spoke it, you would be like, whoa, they're really sizzling that person. And it's inappropriate. I felt it was inappropriate, because I think there's ways to correct behavior and there's ways to do things, but then there's ways, like, you got to develop this sort of, these goggles for like lateral violence, and say, oh, there it is. But then, we talked for years because we would just usually just weather the storm and then try and change the subject, but somebody still got hurt. And I think if you look at Tlingit, we've probably had, if you go back 20 years since we've been doing regular language classes, probably going on for 30 years. And you probably have 1,000 people who've studied Tlingit at some level. But how many of them have carried it through? It's maybe 20 people, 30, 40. And so it's not a high enough success rate. So you always have to analyze what you're doing and figure out how to overcome, and not to ever say, boy, they didn't know what they were doing before, but now we do. But just to continue to sort of emerge to this place where it becomes used. Because I was having a conversation today also. I believe that colonialism leaves a lot of poison pills within us. And those are things that stop us from a true reclamation of our languages. And so those are other things to watch for. And thank you so much for sharing. It was a wonderful list, and thanks for giving us the screenshot of it. It's a fabulous example.
May I add something?
Yes, please.
I was looking at well, as I was reading it, I was pondering our sustainability of running our own programs and to keeping them at the level that we're at, or even stepping on further than that. So I was looking into the education. I like their Basic Education Act that they passed, where they modified it to include the cost for education of all types of education and all different types of languages. And I looked into the Alaska University Trust, where they hold over 150,000 acres of land, and they now currently have $11 billion in a trust account. And so it just kind of irks me a little bit when you have to choose which languages that you're going to endorse, and then which ones you're going to just close down for the time being. So that kind of triggered me, and so I went off researching. But that was a key area that I really looked into, was their Basic Education Act.
Yeah, to make it part of the system, right? And so as you look at standardization and stuff, and really, I think a big step for Alaska could be changing the standards of education so that Alaska Native languages are included in those standards of education. And so that would be a huge shift. So we had a meeting last week, and I gotta do better. I gotta let you folks know about meetings of the Alaska Native Language Preservation and Advisory Council, so you can listen in and give feedback. At some point, if we can get enough legislative support, we're going to expand it and change the name of it. But we can't get legislators to listen to our recommendations. So we're trying a different system. But I think our top recommendations right now are to develop a full Alaska Native language teacher certification and licensure program. So we'll have fully licensed, fully certified teachers of Alaska Native languages. Step 2 would be to include Alaska Native languages in state standards of education. Graduating high school requires 1 year. Graduating college requires 1 year. And it could be a different language, or it could be year 2 of the same language. Those are the baseline. You could always take it further. But that way it becomes something that everybody's responsible for. And that would be a huge shift. And I don't know how we do it, but I think we could. And then phase 3 would be an Alaska Native language teacher in every school. Then I think this would require a bit of a reformation of how we even do this whole thing, so we can have an annual conference on Alaska Native languages, and then we just keep sort of trying to build more and more and more momentum. So those are some of the things that we've been talking about as well, just sort of some teams that are behind the scenes, and these were things that the Alaska Native Language Preservation and Advisory Council is going to be putting forth in our annual report. So that report's going to be made through a series of public meetings, and I'll make sure to post the meetings to this group and to increase communication so you folks know and let others know. And we also want to increase the linguistic representation on that council. So let's take a look at, I had a couple of questions when I was reading this, and I want to get your feedback on these questions. What do you think you should be called? Are you an activist? Are you a language warrior? Are you an advocate? Sometimes there's some dialogue on what to call folks who work in Indigenous languages. I just thought I was curious what your thoughts were. Teacher, student.
Uh,
Oh, okay. Anyone else have thoughts? Escuche.
yeah, actually.
Escuche.
Yeah, I think it was at the language summit. They were handing out bracelets that said Klinka Yukatungi Khegaka on them, and I'm, I like still have that tacked on my board. You know, I thought that was really cool, and in a way, I mean, you know, it is sort of a fight. I'd say to get our language into places of use and to, you know, have standards of education,
Right.
prioritize our language. And I think, you know, we are fighting a system that doesn't prioritize it. So yeah, khegaka.
Okay. I've heard some people say they felt like it was too violent or hostile to say a language warrior. There are, you know, but it's up to you folks. And, you know, just in terms of like the work that we do, and also just sort of like, I don't know, it's just something I hear sometimes that is in dialogue. I was curious what folks thought. Next question. How do you create new words? What's your process? I'm curious to know. Like, you got a word for this thing? It's like turn the TV on, change the channel, turn the volume up and down. How would you make a
In our region, we have a language commission, but they haven't really activated like this part of their work.
Mhm.
But in the last couple of meetings with the language commission, they've been hearing from teachers and from language learners for our own region, the need for that type of engagement with a body. Because you'll have one language speaker interpret into Inupiaq something conceptually different than someone else will, and then there's that tension again when it crosses between two villages about, you know, who's right. And so just some sense that we need a cross-region body that begins to create these new words. And it struck me in the reading that that in 20 years, just in social issues, sciences, and school type language, they needed 15,000 words translated. And to me, that really says something about how fast things are changing for our language learners, and that we need to be responsive to them. And our young language learners are asking for these words because they want to bring Inupiaq into some other, they want to bring Inupiaq into some areas of their life that they think they can use it in.
Nice, yeah, and so there's languages that form committees, and so Benungum Tanu has a word making committee. Hawaii has a word making committee, and then there's some different processes that can be adopted as well, which could be, here's the word we'll use for now, but we'll bring it to the next committee meeting and sort of talk it through, and developing a clear and open process that does respect dialects, but that also sort of encourages the process to happen is good, because yeah, if you have to talk about lava and tectonic plates, and we got, you know, you could just use the name for some of the planets, but we might have names for some of the planets and some of the stars and constellations. There's all kinds of technologies, there's science, there's all kinds of different things that we're going to have to figure out how to utilize, and some of this they need a new word for it, and others you might have to recreate because nobody remembers how to talk about that particular thing because the language hasn't been used as a language of daily use for quite some time. So I think these are important processes. We came up with Baby Yoda pretty fast, and we had this thing about whoever came up, and everyone else like, I should have thought of the Baby Yoda, and you know how to say that. So, duck juice.
Like for a cell phone, um, they came up with um, pocket talker.
Oh,
So
nice.
it'd be Kualai Gusu. And then for laptop, they went more literal. The thing that sits on your lap. And then I can't remember what they did with TV because I didn't um, add it to the dictionary. Um, I think TV was, like the box with everything in it or something like that. Someone might want to correct me on that. But yeah, there's different ways going literal, and then um, sometimes it's adding two different words together. Like for charger, our teacher told us to add lightning and cord together, and you'll have charger. And so I did it, and it it happened to work well for that word. Oh,
How, yeah, that's wonderful. And so this is sort of a lexicon question. So sometimes I call this a lexicon committee. That's a term that could be used for it. But in addition, like, so what are the processes for making sure that we keep track of it? So we don't have three words for mayonnaise that are being used in different communities. And then everyone's got to ask, what? And then everyone's got to keep saying mayonnaise. And so as we kind of just sort of consider this, it also comes down to dictionaries and keeping track of the lists of words and hopefully keeping it under community control so that the community has a way to sort of make sure that it's not in someone else's hand who might leave and take the data with them. And that there's also a process for keeping backups and sort of coming to terms, like what if you have a disagreement? Well, group A is like, this is how you say mayonnaise. Group B is like, this is how you say mayonnaise. Let's go to war. But how to sort of avoid the mayonnaise war and instead come to some sort of process. And usually there's some things that you can implement. Just have an odd number of people on it, and then they say, okay, well, let's just vote. And to try and keep it just like a less emotional attachment. To say, okay, well, here's the word that we're going to use for this thing. Let's go on to the next word. And also, you might have to communicate to some learners, like, hey, you had a great suggestion. The committee decided to go with this instead because it made more sense based on how we construct new compound words, and how to communicate that and not hurt folks' feelings. Jinkasi.
I had a question about words that were being changed. I recently just heard about a change in pronouncing or describing colors. So like it's always been the noun yahyiti, but I just learned from another teacher that I don't know where the change happened, but it's starting to shift to ka, I think like kanata kahini or something. It's ka, and I was like, wow, how did that change happen? And how, I mean, is it how's it going to be distributed to the teachers, and where did it come from?
It's the
Change.
discovery of an additional vocabulary item. So you could still say Eshk Yahyati, it is blue. Eshk Yahyati, cake, that would be a blue dog. But Kacheshk is how you would say blue. Just the noun, it's the color in the noun form. And that was discovered. I was reading, well, I was actually at a meeting of Northwest Coast Native Artists Committee, and the wonderful Nani Dolores Churchill kept talking about this book by Emmons about the Chilkat blanket. So I asked her, I was like, what is this book? And she told me, so I found it. It's out of print, but I found a copy for like $100, and I picked one up. And as I was going through it, to have it as a resource for weavers, I found that there was these descriptions of colors that Emmons had recorded with speakers forever, like 100 years ago. And so that's where I was seeing kakeshk and kakan. And so just trying to sort of incorporate those to say, that's how you would just say red. And that's how you just say blue. But it shouldn't be changing the way we talk about colors. It's just an additional vocabulary item to say the color as a noun. Because in Tlingit, every color, you say it's like this thing, it's like that thing. But attributes it to an existing noun. Duck Juice, your hand is up.
Oh, my bad. I'll put it back down.
Okay, no worries. Victoria.
Oh, yeah. We have I think it's the Tsimshian or the Shemalia Language Authority. I think that's out of Prince Rupert. And usually they put out like a lot of the stuff for School District 52. And then when it comes to over on this side, the Alaska side, I think they came up with a word for computer, Naknolkum Bish, and then the elders, they didn't like that because it was saying it was a supernatural box on this side. So they started calling it Walaishan Bish. I think the computer has like 3 names. And then the language authority came up with the color yellow. And when it's used in a sentence, it says crab poop, and elders don't like that. So they don't like us to say, use a sentence talking about crab poop. They think it's disrespectful. So there's a few instances where people don't agree on it.
Yeah, we have this with foods. There's some foods that were named by ancestors, like honey is gandets aji haki, which is bee poop, which is also inaccurate. I've heard it's bee vomit, but that would also be, and some speakers say, well, that's not very respectful to the food. And then we have the name that was given to a turkey is kiqaik, which is a snot nose. And they say, well, that's not very respectful for the turkey. And then there's some other things too, which indigenous languages sometimes adopt things. Like how do you refer to different ethnicities in your language? Like how do you refer to African Americans or Latinx folks? And sometimes the language itself has to go through its own adjustment in terms of the way that we refer to other people, because soy sauce is an excellent example. And so my uncle taught me kushta shuku, which is land otter urine. And then a lot of people don't like that. And then they say, well, what does land otter urine taste like? I say, I have no idea. And is it black? I don't know. But then the other word for it, I think it is chanwanhini, which comes from Chinaman water, which is perhaps worse. And so sometimes the language has to sort of also have these things. So that the word for someone who's African American is black person, tuchka. Does that need to be adjusted? Yvonne.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really interesting topic for me. And we're very much in the stage where, I think I mentioned before, like we have to respond and figure out how to say these things in the language in live time with the kids. And it's pretty regular. We are really blessed to have 2 elders, Chief Trimble Gilbert from Arctic Village, and then also his sister, Florence Newman, who lives here in Fairbanks. And there are 2 kind of senior language experts who are guiding us in our language. But even when we were asking her early on, when we first opened the chat, like, how do you say turn the light on? And she goes, oh, I always just say light on Otzi or light off Otzi, like turn the light on, turn the light off, or you do that thing. And but she said that's a good question. And we just worked and talked with her and we had a couple other first language speakers in the conversation and came up with Nech Audrey for turn the light on, or it's kind of like a repetitive action of making light or turning or creating light sort of thing. And then Audrey Nakia for turning, literally like you're turning the light off. because it's just not something that was in the language before. Before it might have been something related to like starting the fire or something like that. But and similar to what you were just speaking about, I know Trimble has already begun to change some of those words in the language, and in some of our working with him, will be exactly like you said, neighboring Indigenous nations or other people that, or food items in particular that just receive names that just are really not appropriate in our contemporary context. And so just in the time that I've been doing some language documentation work with Trimble in live time, like he'll just use a new name for something and I'll say, oh, and then he'll say, that's a good way of saying it, huh? I mean, he'll say it in the language to me like that. And I'll say, yeah, that's a good way. Excellent. And then we just capture it. And then we just start using that word and that language for that thing. But we have also talked about needing to become a little bit more systematic about it, because we have a whole Gwich'in nation that spans 3 territories, and there's other language work happening, and we do want to be consistent, like you said, so we don't also have the mayo wars occur, the mayonnaise wars happen as well, because so we've begun talking about it, but we're not quite systematically there yet of creating something like a Gwich'in language committee that spans the entire nation, so that we can all reach mutual agreement on things like turn on the light, turn off the light, or kind of these new names that are more appropriate for some of the items. So yeah, one of them, like people often refer to rice as datsotrin, which is, mouse droppings. And some people really didn't like that. And so then the other word that some people used to use is nenjiki, which is ant babies. And so people liked ant babies more than mouse droppings for rice. And so we've kind of just shifted over to just using Nanjigi for rice, at least in the context of when we're using it. And we're getting less people concerned with that language around it. But anyways, that's the way that we're kind of approaching it. But then the last thing I want to comment on just the article in general, the most recent one was, because I've been thinking a lot about this as well. And this ties back to something that you mentioned the Language Commission Committee recommended as far as creating these requirements for language learning at all K-12 and at the university levels, is that we just don't have people prepared to step into those sorts of positions. So even if every one of the schools, just among Gwich'in Nation lands, all of a sudden had a full-time teacher position for language available, we'd be really hard pressed to find someone who's certified as a teacher or who's prepared to be a language instructor to take all those positions. And so I like that article and kind of like the progression that the Inari Sámi did of getting to a point of doing the 1-year programs that were like more full immersion for a year, so that they can more rapidly produce, stepping into the jobs that were becoming available. And so that's something that I think I've also been thinking a lot about, of kind of what's that next stage. Last point I'll make also is kind of a reflection of your comment about 1,000 students coming through a program, but only 20 or 40 maybe pushing through to becoming proficient speakers of the language. And because we have that same experience of a lot of people progressing a little bit, and then a gap happens where they're not practicing and using the language, and all of a sudden it's like they're having to rebuild, and I've experienced this myself, rebuild the base of the knowledge of the language again. And so what does it look like to have the spaces where, as we're building our knowledge base of the language, that we continually have the opportunity to be using it regularly, so we don't lose some of what we've gained and we continue to expand our knowledge. And so those are just some of the elements and pieces that I've been thinking a lot about lately.
And yeah, so a process that doesn't slow things down, but that allows, like, okay, let's come up with this and we'll use it, take it back to the larger committee, and we might have to just adjust it later. And I think the language community will get used to it, right? Because, if the kids have to adjust, this is no longer baby ants, this is, it's like, because yeah, we used to call it maggots, but then we gave it the name for like a tlingit form of rice that we had. But then also just thinking of, how are you going to maintain these word lists, and how are you going to keep this updated, and how are you going to as we add new words, I think a language learning community often gets excited about that. Like, oh, look, they came up with a word for this thing. That's cool. There's a word for this. And then it could be to the point where uh, it's pretty common that if they find a new constellation or some new black hole or something, that they'll ask the Hawaiians to name it because they're very tied in with astronomy and some of those communities. So it could be that some things end up getting a name from your language, which is really pretty amazing.
Oh, one last, I almost forgot one point is that, and it was kind of a thought that came up around the commission's request that if or when we get to a time where more of these jobs are created for people to step into language work, that their job descriptions are based on, having established a foundation of maybe learning the language or doing work around the language. But then they can be considered on the job training opportunities for people who are working towards proficiency, so they could actually have a full-time job or half-time job or whatever it might be, dedicated to allow them to put in that added time to learn their language and to do work on the language. Because I think that's the other piece that we're learning that the Choctaw is providing for a few of us that was just so needed, so that there can be this added time and energy and focus to deepen study and use of the language, to hopefully be creating more proficient speakers.
And there's always a balance in there's multiple. It's like we're trying to balance like one thing on like a little tiny fulcrum, and it's in 3-dimensional, and there's lots of weights on it and stuff. Because it's a capacity issue in a lot of ways. Like we just don't have the teachers, but then you also don't have the students to supply more teachers, and then you don't have the places to learn the language. And it's just these huge deficit models. And I have heard from other language communities that say we spread ourselves too thin. And now we don't know what to do because everybody's overwhelmed and their language levels are going down instead of up. So there are some of these like real concerns. However, like sometimes if you're teaching 20 people every year the language, but then that sort of grows to 200 people, that can create some crisis points, but it can also create some ways to sort of say, oh wow, like now we can sort of try a whole bunch of new things. And then what you might find is after doing that for 5 years and sort of crashing through it a little bit, you find that you really have a good process developed down the road. But these are things that we're going to try to do systematically so that we have resources and processes and say, well, what do you need? How do we get it to you? What do you need? How do we get it to you? How do we build this thing? How do we do that? Because once we create actual systems for these languages to fully exist and to be part of the thing that everybody's doing, then maybe that opens up a whole bunch more doors for increased funding and increased resource development, and sort of move beyond like, hey, we got to bring someone in to make a dictionary for us, to like, we got to bring someone in to teach us how to make a dictionary so we don't have to bring anybody in ever again, right? So that we build those expertise areas and we find these folks. And maybe you have someone who wants to learn the language, but they don't want to be a teacher because they just don't want to stand up in front of people and lead conversations and do stuff like that. But maybe they end up being the person who maintains the dictionary and maintains the website and does some of that stuff. Ila Tova.
Yeah, on a personal level, as far as naming new things goes, I was having this conversation with one of my friends in the Danaka Learning Circle, and I had a picture of 3 starfish. I wanted to say, I see 3 starfish, but I didn't know we don't have starfish in the interior of Alaska. But she was like, well, you took the picture on Alutiiq waters, so what's the native name for it there? And it was Agiagwak. So I just rewrote it using our orthography because we say the same sounds, but we spell them differently. And then I put it in italics. So that's how I deal with things like that as much as I can in my own personal expression, is try to use the native name, because now we know how to look things up in other cultures. And that's why I have a pretty strong opinion about the word for soy sauce, because soy sauce has a native name. It's native to China. And so I know in Japanese, they've adapted it there. And in Japan, it's called shoyu. And they use the same characters as you would in Chinese, but they use their own pronunciation. So the first character, sho, means a type of miso, which comes from soybeans. And then yu comes from oil. It means oil. So it's like oil of the soybeans. So I know in Hawaii, they call soy sauce shoyu because there's been a strong Japanese influence in Hawaii. But that's kind of how I'm thinking about things like soy sauce, turkey. You know, turkeys are native to somewhere. So, you know, we could probably find out their native name and just adapt it.
Yeah, because we do that sometimes with pumpkin or pineapple. And so borrowing nouns makes a lot of sense. And it's something we've been doing forever. Like, you know, so I don't know how it happened. There was probably a Tlingit and maybe someone who was Shoshone or Tagish. And they're probably talking, and a fox walked by. And the thing is like, what the heck is that? So Nagase. Like, oh, okay, well, that's what we'll call it. And so that gets incorporated. So, like, one of the things that we could talk about and explore is like dictionary software, and there's a bit of a learning curve to some of this stuff, but some of it is really built to once you've got a system in place and you've got one person or a group of people who really kind of understand how it works, you can come in so that you can make an entry, and then you have like in blue what we call the translation equivalent. So that's fox. And then you could say, well, this is specifically a red fox. Then you can put other information in here. So you can say, oh, yeah, whatever the scientific name for the fox is, and I could put it in here. And then you can also mark what type of thing this is. So, where is it at? Oh, I gotta go up here. So you can mark it as a compound noun, or is it a noun, or is it a verb, or is it it's a verbal, it's a noun from a verb. I think somewhere down here I've got borrowed noun. You know, so you can come up with like what are the parts of speech. And then in terms of the language community, there's always a bit of a balance here as well. Like there could be folks from the linguistic community who are saying, well, actually this thing is a that thing. And you say, well, no, we just call it this because that works for us, you know. But a borrowed noun would be, yeah, it comes from Russian, it comes from, we could take it from Chinese, we could take it from, you know, or Cantonese or whatever. We take it from a variety of places, and you could note that in the dictionary. And then the dictionary could have, in terms of like trying to make a dictionary useful as well, what's the appropriate amount of cultural information as well? Because you might have things in there, like if a brown bear, if there's a whole bunch of cultural rules for whether or not you talk about a brown bear, you could include that in there under the explanation category where you could put some things in there. Like we had um, this word jinnaha, which used to be defined in some of the I think in the older dictionaries they called it like fortune or bad luck. But it was a little bit more complicated than that. It was sort of like if you violate some law that's a cultural law, then the jinnaha is what's going to be coming your direction towards you or your people or your community. And so just sort of sometimes those things require a bit more explanation. But if you have these abilities within your language community, the folks who are active, who are there, who are really part of the process, and you also have a good, clear understanding of, well, if you quit and you go somewhere else, you got to leave this here, you know. So having plans for data backup, having plans for keeping track of this stuff. How do you document your language? Is it nouns? And you know, for Tlingit these days, I'm doing everything that's not a verb, all alphabetized, and then everything that is a verb, alphabetized by the verb root. Good stuff, folks. Any other thoughts on word making? So the other thing I was thinking about in reading this was Pucci.
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be hard. Like I was in one workshop where two groups of elders, we broke in and we were trying to come up with a word for microwave. And we were there for 2 hours and I don't think we had a final decision. But, you know, a lot of those older words like ange, shugwa, kahwe, just like what Anna was talking about, you know, I mean, that's what our ancestors did. You know, they took, you know, we didn't have coffee or oranges or sugar, and then we just took how they said it with our accent, and that was our new word for it. So I
Yeah.
didn't really think about that until just now, but
Yeah, sometimes that's the process of borrowed words, is you just take how it's said in English and you adopt it to the language. So peaches becomes guiches, beans becomes guines. That's very common. If you go to Hawaii, beer is pia. And so it just sort of, that's how you'd say that particular word. And usually what you have is sort of a rule. You have a set of rules, like an R becomes a W, a B becomes a GW, and stuff like that. Yeah, okay. So I was also thinking, folks, about these different language realms or programs. I do want to look at a couple more quotes from this article, but let's just brainstorm, like, where are the places that we could be bringing the language? So some of the, they listed a bunch in the article, and then I thought of a few others. So like, it's a subject in school. It's the medium for instruction in school. You have language nests, adult language instruction, adult immersion programs, radio broadcasts, television broadcasting, publication of teaching materials, publication of literature, visible in social media, church services in the language, cover band, poetry contest, etc. in the language. I was thinking of Gaelic has like annual poetry contests in the language, language and science, language and local government. What else? What's not on the list?
And this mentorship, maybe, unless that's a subcategory of one of these
Oh, what was it again?
apprenticeships.
Oh, yes. Language in the home. Oops.
What about like when the students get a break and you hear the language on the playground? I don't know if that applies.
Yeah. Right, because you don't want the students to be in the language for the school, but then when they're going to do their own thing, they always switch to English. I mean, that's probably going to be the case, but just sort of like having a tactic to sort of work around that. And we had, so playing in the language and doing stuff like that.
Hune, we have like in the villages that still speak Unangam Tinu, there are like, I don't know how to say this. There's like local places where you can go and hear the language being spoken, like the grocery store is a really important one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most communities have some form of restaurant, cafe type thing, and are there ways to sort of kind of have a language evening at the local dining place and just say, work in partnership with those places. Say, hey, can we just like book the whole place and just have the, and it would be so fun because it's a reclamation a lot of times when you're doing this stuff.
Video games too. The kids are playing with their friends, and a whole bunch of them were. It's like Klingish, they're speaking English and Klingish, but they were using a lot.
Yeah, I mean they're already playing Minecraft and Roblox and what's the
Blowing
one?
houses up and whatnot.
That's right. Never forget. I'm just kidding.
City and park signage. I've never taken a Spanish class, but I know baño is bathroom in Spanish because I've been to California.
Yeah, right. And so to put it out, like this is a big part of the normalization of the language, is to put the language out in different places. Any other thoughts?
Maps, putting our traditional names back in place. I hate it when, people from elsewhere show up and they've been here 10 seconds to our 12,000 years or whatever it is. And then they say, oh, we're going to start calling this place Cathedral Rock. And over here is Punchbowl Cove. And I was like, that's not our names. And you don't even know how disrespectful that is.
Yeah. And then also to like maintain an environment of language use and promotion, but then also have an expectation eventually of how to say these. So there's places I go to Hawaii, at least I used to, and there were places I would go where they expect you to know how to say that name. I called, I was like, when's the bus come to Honolulu? And they said, to where? And I knew I said it wrong, but then they would make me say it again. So then I said it again, and then they corrected me. It was Honomu. So, but then I knew, and I actually really liked that. I was embarrassed I didn't know, but I really liked that there was an expectation of knowing. And there's also creating this shift of an expectation of use, which is, Alaska is as a concept among those who formed it as a state and many who continue to govern it as a state, it's a white English speaking place. And if we're going to push back on that, we have to have strategies on when folks are going to sort of give us that speak English or go live somewhere else type of mentality, which is going to be hopefully rare, if ever, but just sort of overcoming some of that mentality to sort of, we're rerouting the language in a place. It's never been unrooted, but we are rerouting it in terms of what other people who aren't familiar with it understand about the place.
So as we talk about city and park signage and place names and maps, and just look at our native names, like it's still once in a while tough for me. It's 3 years now I've been using, or is it only 2? I don't know. Sense of time is warped in this age. But I'm using my native name to reference myself instead of only in the native context, which took a shift. I mean, I had to go through months before I would even be willing to go there. But we still feel awkward trying to incorporate our native names anywhere outside of the homework of, outside of our Indigenous spaces. And in that same realm of our villages, I've been trying to do the same with our mascots, our village names, our student names, and we have varying levels of comfort and even familiarity of all of those things. So I don't know how that fits in this.
Yeah. Well, as an individual, it can be very complicated because someone could be born and give them the name Joe, but then they learn their language and they discover maybe they have an Indigenous name already, or they receive one and they say, I would prefer to be called my Indigenous name from now on. And there might be folks who say, oh, that's wonderful. But then there might be folks that they're even related to who will deliberately refuse to call them by their Indigenous name, or to do so in a way that's kind of insulting them, to say, oh, I'll call you this. And those are complicated scenarios that we can work through as a language community as well by putting those up and saying, hey, this is actually an act of decolonization, and this is okay. And, we're not going to be able to get everybody on board with everything. But then when we come back to the names on the land, I think you can develop. So I'm going to give you folks some ideas. And if you know some legislators, call them, send them an email. And just say, you know what, we need to get our place names back on the land. I think it could be a multi-phase process. And I'll I'll share the outline with you folks. I'll share the text with you folks, maybe on Wednesday. But like phase one is what I would call spelling corrections. There's all kinds of places all across Alaska where the name of that place obviously comes from an indigenous name. Sitka, Takatna, right? There's so many places. And what we could do now is, as some of the orthographies have been standardized a little bit, and not always, sometimes there's going to be a fight, but we say, oh, well, actually, that was just spelled wrong. And then we do a spelling correction, but then at the same time, we push for a pronunciation correction as well. And we start to try and say, okay, we could say Angoon instead of Angoon. And we start to sort of push for these things in terms of what's the expectation. What's written is sort of like, oh, well, we're actually going to write these using the characters we use to write our language now. I think phase two would be finding places that are directly related to colonial violence. So was this person some kind of racist person like Shattuck? Yeah, I guess a beef with that guy. And then there's a street named after that person who said, who are you to want to mingle with us with 5,000 years of history? You guys are just barely out of savagery, talking to Alaska Native people. Like, don't put that guy's name on a street. But then some of it could be other things too. We have a place where an elder told us some Tlingit women were sexually assaulted, and then they named that place Seduction Point. So there are sometimes places that are directly affiliated with anti-Indigenous violence, and we can restore the place names on those. And it's important that, I almost said it myself, we don't say rename, and we don't allow people to say rename. We say, oh no, we're restoring the original name. It was renamed by someone else. We're just undoing that. Then I think the next phase is finding batch names for places that don't have official names, where we could put a whole bunch of Indigenous place names through a process that we streamline with the government. Then the fourth phase is going to be removing colonial names. And then I think we're going to have to go with some low-hanging fruit, like maybe there's some stuff that people might not care too much about. Then there might be some bigger ones, like Fairbanks, whoever that person is. Uh-oh, now they turn the lights out on me. Sorry, Fairbanks.
Yeah, it's funny you say Fairbanks because there's no real name for Fairbanks as a city, in the local Diné language. And it's a question I get pretty regularly, actually. And so there need to be some kind of a process or mechanism. There are names for Fairbanks in the surrounding Diné nations. Like many of us, including Gwich'in, we have a name for Fairbanks, but that's a Gwich'in name for Fairbanks, not a Diné name for Fairbanks. And so it's like, so that it gets, and for like Denali probably has, I would estimate, maybe 6 different or so Indigenous names for it, but it happened to be one of the Diné languages that became the most known name, and that's the name that was applied to it, Denali. And so in those cases, there would have to be some thought into how do you approach, if some places either have no names or some places have names from multiple different languages, which name is the name that gets standardized or used. In the case of Denali, it has such a long-standing presence with Denali, and there was such a huge fight around just getting that name restored in the first place that, maybe there wouldn't be a lot of energy needed to be put into it. But I mean, I think in general, returning to the traditional place names is the way to go. And in some of our places in rural Alaska, we only have traditional place names for a lot of the spaces around our villages already. So that place, it just needs to be kind of implemented, kind of a standardized mechanism for formally applying those names to all those places.
Yeah, so I think a step to move towards this would be to get the legislature to initiate a 5-year Alaska Native language place name restoration plan, or whatever they want to call it, project. And that way there's a definitive timeline, and we say we get as many as we can in as many languages as we can restored. And there are going to be some that are going to require some thought and conversations. Like same thing, we didn't have names for big old cities because there weren't really big old cities. So, and we just have like places within it. So it's like, just like now in Juneau, there's different parts of Juneau, and we refer to those like the flats or the valley or whatever. And it could just follow along sort of those things. we're also going to have to come up with new names for things. And then we're also going to have to come to consensus, because what they will do is they'll say, they can't even agree. Let's just keep it as it is. They can't even agree. But, they're just looking for an excuse to not do it. So
Yeah. Yeah. Can I elaborate on that just a tad? Well, like I would love, like how you're saying there's different places, like there, uh, in Juneau, like it's great that I wish they had the specific place names like on Instagram or Facebook. You can say your location is Aquan territory, which is great, but it would be great if each place name had a specific place to where you're at. And then I feel like also businesses, local businesses will have like taku fisheries or chilkat cones, and those are not they're neighboring, but they're not in Juneau. So sometimes that history can like confuse people. So local businesses maybe need to like know what's okay and what isn't okay for naming them. And then also the campus could be renamed too, but it's just like so many things. But I know there was a disagreement because the Taku people moved here in the late 1800s, but a lot of people think that Douglas is their ancestral homeland, but it's not. The Aquan migrated here 10,000 years ago. So then the city said, okay, well, we're just going to call this all Tlingit Ani, which just means human being land, which could literally be anywhere in the world. So that's just something like they need to be broken down, and the importance of why the specific places are so important and the history behind them. And I think social media is a great way to like get that information out there with the different locations, and then also like why you should be so specific.
Geesh. Okay.
And so I wanted to say too, as we look at like a plan that could roll out that we might want to recommend to the state, part of the excuse I see we can't get along and even decide what we want. I think even before we start looking externally, that we also prepare for the resistance we're going to meet internally, where a lot of people still aren't comfortable with the fact we still are in denial. We're still in denial about assimilation and colonization. We have communities who weren't as drastically affected necessarily. And so in terms of a willingness to speak to it and a willingness to acknowledge when it feels like we're still in control, because it happens so subtly or in ways that our leaders had been comfortable with at the time, whatever it might be, that I think we're still going to have a lot of our own who will put as much resistance as the powers that be, and to have that opportunity to unpack and to have that opportunity to release and have that opportunity to heal would be so important, so that when we do get to the point that we're saying, hey, we're a community that's doing it. I mean, I think we both have to have both at the same time. Sometimes it's okay if the policy is open before we're ready to embrace it. But even I've been thinking about this as I looked for the names of our communities. We have a community in our district that is similar to Fairbanks. Like all the names that we've used for that community has been everyone else's, but not their own. And they still would have to decide on their own which of the names that they have, because they came together later, would be used. But beyond that, if you look at Shishmaref, for example, none of us know anything about who Shishmaref was. I learned it at one point, and having learned it, I don't care who he was, and he has no business, dominating our sense of identity. But we are very proud of being from Shishmaref. We are also very proud of being from Kiraktak, and everybody knows that we're also from Kiraktak. But if we were to approach right now, I honestly don't know if people would be willing and ready to say, let's scrap Shishmaref and officially be Kirukta. Maybe, but to have those opportunities to plant the seed and let it grow and let people think internally in the small spaces, so that we're not the ones to say, no, don't make us, because that is a very real possibility.
And I think there's ways to engage in these conversations because there's a category that I believe in official place names where you can have a also known as. So you could say, okay, yeah, if we'll keep this as the also known as. And I think we have to prepare for all the counter arguments. And some of them are going to come from our own people. Like, someone might say, oh, my great grandparent was married to whoever Gastineau. What are you doing to my family, right? And then we also have to be ready for the colonial argument, which is going to be you're trying to erase us, which is it's always so funny, like to hear. It's not funny, but it's just ironic to hear, like, colonizers talk about their history being erased. Like, no one's gonna remember us. Our history is like we are actually living that exact nightmare, and it's not gonna happen because that person was like a supervisor at the Forest Service who never even came to Alaska. It's not a big deal. Just go, I don't know. But just preparing for those, because if you're testifying and it's a congressperson saying that on the record and they're asking you to give a response, you have to be able to respond to those things and not to, you want to laugh at them and then you don't want to also get caught off guard, but just to sort of prepare all those arguments ahead of time. Because the other thing that folks are going to say is well, we'd like to, but what if we have to call the ambulance and the ambulance needs to come over and the dispatcher can't say it right, and now people die because they can't say the name right, but they're just, I think they're pretty weak arguments at their core, but just sort of like, it's like, yeah, anybody can learn. We could teach people, and you're gonna have to learn. A friend of mine, like when you go to Hawaii, there's all these names. You just learn these names in Hawaii, and so fabulous. So a couple of updates on the class. So I'm working on this blog. It's called languagesforever.com. My goal, like if you go there, there's just some kind of placeholder stuff. But eventually I'm going to put a lot of, like any of the slideshows that we go over in class, I'm going to put them there. A link to a recording of every class, I'm going to put it there. So if you ever couldn't make it to class, had to leave early, wanted to check something out, see what we talked about, I'm going to try to have it so it says the class, the general topics we covered, the resources that we are looking at, and then the handout. So probably won't have it might not have a link to every reading we've done because they might have publication, copyright type of stuff, but I will certainly put the titles to it. So I'll be working on that over the next week or so. And let's see, we will talk on Wednesday about who's talking about TPRS. Make sure everybody's signed up to lead a discussion for one of these methods. So if your name isn't on that list, we can make sure we add you by Wednesday. No big deal, no pressure. We'll also start talking about our midterm and final assignments. Again, no pressure, but a chance to sort of do a bit of on-the-ground language work in this environment. And I really enjoyed the discussion today, folks. We said we were going to close with, what were our two phrases? So someone's going to say, I'm going to go now. And then, well, I guess the first person will start by saying that. And then someone will respond in their language with saying, have a good day. I'm going to go now. So I guess I'll start, and anybody who wants to respond in your language, you will respond by saying, have a good day, and then I will go now. Det qua gut.
Shicha, nidrin gozu, akot chahisha.
Singai lach Kaiden.
So Talsia, Adagoya Nigalachtenik.
Uvlulotak olagniak tunga akupenyak.
Gits qua dangui gin la sang, sao kaidang.
Amani
Kahut,
Tara Amasa.
kahute matani.
Kuchtek Kwaragut.
Kuchua, Diagan.
Okay, loa, gulchish, how a koyanak, masicho, anabasi, doiction. Thanks so much, folks, and we will see you on Wednesday. Hoa,
Direction.
doiction,
Anamase.
anabasi, koyanak.
Nere,
Ni